The title of Bob Woodward's new book, Rage, comes from an interview Woodward and I conducted with the then candidate Donald Trump in 2016. Mr. Trump told us, quote, "I do bring rage out. I always have." Woodward told me later that the quote was revealing and mattered. It showed how Trump sees himself. And the president's critics, they certainly raged this week when they learned what President Trump told Woodward about the coronavirus in February. Will the president pay a political price with American voters? It's hard for any reporter to say. But this time, there are tapes.
You just breathe the air. That's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus. This is deadly stuff.
The president told Woodward on February 7th that he fully understood the threat. But he said this just weeks later to the American people.
It's going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle. It will disappear. And from our shores, it could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens.
And he told Woodward in March that he deliberately played it down.
I wanted to always play it down. I still like playing it down.
Yes, sir.
Because I don't want to create a panic.
Democrats are appalled and say the president lied to Americans.
The fact that the president knew, he'd been saying for a long time the whole thing was a hoax. His delay, denial, and distortion of what was happening has caused many deaths.
But the president has dismissed the criticism.
They wanted me to come out and scream, people are dying, we're dying. No, we did it just the right way. We have to be calm.
Joining us tonight are three of Washington's top reporters. Asma, Khalid, political correspondent for National Public Radio. Ashley Parker, White House reporter for The Washington Post. And Michael Schmidt, Washington correspondent for The New York Times and author of Donald Trump versus the United States, Inside the Struggle to Stop a President. Ashley, let's begin with you. You've been reporting in recent days on the fallout of the Woodward book. Why does that February 7th remark by the president matter? What was he doing at that time? What was he not saying to the American public?
Right, the question is really what he wasn't doing and what he wasn't saying, and it's a fascinating about 10-day window from which Woodward recounts in his book from when Robert O'Brien goes into the Oval Office and tells the president the coronavirus is going to be the biggest national security crisis of your presidency, to when Trump tells Bob Woodward, he conveys to him that he understands the severity, that he understands that it is deadly, it is tricky, and that it is airborne. And in that period, he really does not convey that grim reality to the American public in words, for starters, so they can begin preparing and figure out if they need masks and if they have members of their family with comorbidities and what steps they should be taking to protect themselves. And if you look at how he spends that time, for instance, the night he gets that warning from Robert O'Brien, he goes and he holds a rally in Wildwood, New Jersey. That weekend, he gets on his plane as they're just starting up the coronavirus task force, Air Force One, and he flies down to Mar-a-Lago, where he spends both days of the weekend golfing. That Sunday is Super Bowl Sunday, and he hosts a Super Bowl bash at Mar-a-Lago in West Palm Beach. And so you really see a president who, in both action and words, was not taking the steps you would expect a responsible leader to take to warn their citizens of a coming deadly pandemic.
Mike, Ashley referenced a conversation, a briefing the president had from Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, in late January of 2020. In your own book, you paint a portrait of this president dealing with advisors during crisis, sometimes listening to them, sometimes ignoring them. When you hear the Woodward tapes and his reporting and compare notes, in a sense, what does this all reveal about President Trump and his use of power?
Well, I think that what it shows is that the president has been completely sort of unshackled here in the last 2 years of his presidency. In the first 2 years, he had folks like John Kelly, he had folks like Don McGahn that were there, that were containers. But Trump had found a way to hollow those folks out. And that left him in a place where he was even more free to do what he wanted. And he didn't have someone like Kelly there who was running the day-to-day operations in the White House like the general that he was. And what this shows, you see this in his decision to sit down with Woodward and talk to Woodward, in his approach to the coronavirus and his approach to everything, that the president still doesn't seem to understand the consequences of different things in Washington. He thought he could charm Woodward and that talking to him would be beneficial to himself. At times it looks like he thought he could talk the coronavirus away from the American people and downplay it, and that things would be better. And here we are coming to the end of the 4th year of his presidency, and it doesn't seem like the president has evolved much.
Asma, you've done a lot of reporting for National Public Radio about voters in the key swing states of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Michigan. You've also focused on independent voters who may be tracking the president's conduct on the pandemic. We've had so many controversies during the Trump presidency. Does this break through with those voters in those states?
You know, honestly, I think that is the key question that we're going to be following up on in the weeks ahead. What I will say is that, you know, you can look at the tracking polls of how the president has handled the coronavirus pandemic. And what I'm struck by is you can go back to a point in, say, early April, where the president's general approval rating broadly amongst the American public was hovering right around 50%. He's now, you know, viewed as, I believe I checked it earlier today, it was like less than 40% of the public believes that he's handling the pandemic correctly. And when you look at where those numbers have dropped off, they've dropped off among Democrats, and they've also dropped off some amongst independents. I have been texting with a bunch of voters that I've met, you know, earlier on this summer in some of these key battleground counties. And one gentleman I talked to earlier today, I thought what was interesting is he is a Republican, but he messaged me back earlier today and said, I feel less confident in voting for Trump today than when we spoke earlier this summer. He's really not sure what to do. He is very nervous that a vote for Joe Biden would plummet the economy, and he is a small business owner. And so, you know, that goes back to the president's inability, though, to actually talk about an issue in which he does seem to have an apparent strength with voters, and that's the economy. The pandemic has not been a strength for him, as we've seen for months and months, and that's what most voters are talking about right now.
What a snapshot of this campaign. All of us reporters are doing our best. Asma, texting with voters. We're doing our best to connect. Ashley, you're also reporting on the Trump presidency and the economy. And this week, the Senate GOP failed to pass its so-called skinny bill, $500 billion coronavirus relief bill. And as we stay on this pandemic topic, it's not just about the Woodward book. It's also about what will Washington do. Does the failure of the Senate Republican bill mean that President Trump will finally step into the negotiations, or are talks essentially dead between now and the election?
That's a great question, and it's one even before Senate Republicans failed to pass this much more slimmed down version of a bill that people were putting to the president fairly directly, which was that one of his selling points was that he claimed to be a deal maker and a businessman and someone who wasn't particularly ideological and who would get down and dirty and cut deals with the Democrats. And so far, we simply have not seen that in about the past year or so. And some of that is the president's sort of deep-seated anger and frustration towards Speaker Pelosi for impeaching him, frankly. And the president has basically said as much earlier this week or last week that he doesn't really feel like he can go out and negotiate with Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. Now, again, could that change? Potentially, the president changes his mind sometimes based on the hour or on the day. But right now, the outlook for something getting through both chambers of Congress is not particularly good right now.
Asma, one of the revealing moments for me this week as a reporter is watching Vice President Biden on Wednesday, speaking to follow up on Ashley's point about the economy and coronavirus relief. He responded briefly to the Woodward book, but then he gave his full economic speech in Michigan. What is the Biden pitch now on the economy, and what's their closing message at this point?
Yeah, I will say my connection's a little poor, but I think you were asking me what the Biden closing economic message is. Is that right?
It is, correct.
Okay, great. So in a nutshell, what he has been emphasizing quite a bit has been this Made in America vision. It might sound, and some Republican Trump-based voters will say that it is a reiteration in their view of the Make America Great Again policies that President Trump was promoting. But look, it's different to some degree. I mean, it is a largely manufacturing-based policy that he's been focusing on. And, you know, he was out there in Michigan, a state that Democrats lost in 2016, touting the need to have more manufacturing jobs here in the United States, but also specifically spelling out policies that he believes would help that, whether it's a 10% tax penalty for companies that are offshoring, or whether it's a 10% tax credit, he says, for companies that bring some of this manufacturing back to the United States. You know, what I'm struck by, though, is the degree to which Democrats, this, you know, being the Democratic nominee himself, is talking about the need to offshore manufacturing. And this is a different economic conversation than Democrats had been having in some previous cycles.
Mike, Congress may be stalled when it comes to coronavirus negotiations, but they're investigating, at least in the House, this whistleblower complaint that inside the Department of Homeland Security, an official is claiming that he and others have been told to ignore Russian interference in this election and focus on interference and activity by Iran in China. And so I don't want to forget that issue of interference. And what's the importance, in your view, as a reporter, of this whistleblower report?
Well, it's just another example of how either the intelligence community or the law enforcement world has been tilted in the president's direction. Institutions mimic the people that run them. And the president has made himself incredibly clear on what he thinks of Russian interference, what he thinks of 2016, and how he doesn't think it's a problem here. You have to remember, and as I laid out in the book, 2016 was the greatest intelligence failure since September 11th of 2001. And the federal government has not taken nearly enough measures to have a different footing coming into another election. So not only are we at a similar or maybe even worse footing than we were in 2016, but at the same time, there are now accusations that the federal government, the intelligence part of the government, is skewing the information it has to downplay that threat. So we're coming at it with the same, if not worse, tools and disinformation with our own government about a potential disinformation campaign.